So we're going to let people come in for a minute or so, and then we're going to get started.
Yay. Hey, Terry from Atlanta. I know you. I know quite a few names on this list. Hey, Nate. I know. Nate from Buffalo. How you doing, man? It's nice to see you. Nate, everywhere I go, I tell people how wonderful Buffalo is. And I'm cheering for your football team too, despite it all. Wow, Singapore.
Commitment.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for doing that.
Wonder what time it is in Singapore.
It's at midnight. I have to say, it's been on my list of places I would love to visit. Have not had an opportunity, but have some friends who have, and yeah, seems like an amazing place. Thanks for being here.
So I'm going to start this. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. The Authors Forum is a series within On the Park Bench, and it discusses recently published books by urbanists or of interest to urbanists. Today's Authors Forum: Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for a Strong Town, with author Charles Marohn, and a discussion with interviewer Jocelyn Gibson. So share your thoughts on hashtag On the Park Bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB and register for coming webinars. Tuesday, October 12th at 12 noon Eastern Time, another Authors Forum, Restorative Cities, Urban Design for Mental Health and Well-Being, with authors Jenny Rowe and Layla McKay and interviewer Stephanie Bothwell. And Tuesday, October 26th, also 12 noon ET, Design for Adaptation, the Climate Challenge for New Urbanism, with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk and interviewer/moderator Rick Cole. Go to cnu.org/resources on the Park Bench. Whoops. And I wanted to remind everybody to save the dates for CNU 30 in Oklahoma City, which is taking place March 23rd through 26th, 2022. And it's going to be CNU's first in-person Congress since 2019. Everybody's really excited about that. Getting together once again with all the people that we've been mainly communicating with on Zoom, and learn how a clear commitment to urbanism, careful financing, and resident engagement can spark a city's renaissance. Learn more at cnu.org/CNU30. Registrations are going to be open December 1st on CNU 30 Oklahoma City, but you can go to the website and you can find out travel arrangements, where it's going to take place, and the hotels and so forth. It's going to be a great show. Charles Marohn, the author of Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, is the founder and president of Strong Towns. He is a professional engineer and land use planner with decades of experience. And his new book came out this month. He is based in Brainerd, Minnesota. And Jocelyn Gibson, our interviewer, is a senior planner with the zoning consultancy firm ZoneCo. She recently joined the board of directors for the Congress for New Urbanism. She is based in Cincinnati. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's Public Square. Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for a Strong Town, published by Wiley, pulls back the curtain on the assumptions and approaches that go into building and maintaining our transportation systems. The transportation systems, particularly our streets and roads, are the bones of our communities. How we build them have consequences that extend down through generations, affecting everybody's lives. Parts of the book made me very angry because of the cavalier disregard for the impact on everyday lives that is vividly described by Charles Marohn. But there is much more to this book, and we're going to be hearing more about that in the next hour. We're going to start with a presentation by Chuck Marohn, and then we're going to have a discussion with Jocelyn Gibson, and we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom and ask your questions as they occur to you, because they will likely be answered more or less in the order that they are asked. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass this along to Chuck.
Great. Thank you, Rob, and appreciate it. Thank you also to Rick Cole and all my CNU friends. I see Andres is on here. Many thanks for everything over many years to him and to all of you. These are my best friends here, so I'm humbled again to be able to share some thoughts and ideas with you. CNU is so many amazing thoughts and ideas have come out of CNU. And for me, when I was asked to chat here for 15 minutes about my book at the beginning, I didn't want to kind of preach to the choir. I was like, how can I add some value to the conversation we're having here? There's so many things that I've learned from you that I'm just, that are in the book that, I'm not going to reflect back to you, because I think, the experts here are in a sense in the room. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what's in chapter 8, which gets into the financing of highways and the way that we build them. CNU has been a leader in highway removal and the whole conversation about highway removal. And I hope that chapter 8 of the book gives a little bit more to the toolkit. I focus in this chapter on I-49 in Shreveport. I-49 is a highway, I don't even know where it starts, up north somewhere, and it runs down to Lafayette, Louisiana. And there's a couple of little segments of this highway that were never completed. And they were never completed because they were dumb. They didn't make sense. The one in Shreveport is called the Inner City Connector. It runs through the historic Black neighborhood of Allendale in Shreveport. And the cost of this project is $700 million to complete this little 2.5 mile stretch through the heart of the city. The project is one that I think at CNU we would look at and say this should never be done. But there's a group there called the Committee of 100, along with all the kind of DOT bureaucracies that we're all used to that have been promoting this project for decades. As part of the environmental review process, as part of the project promotion process, as part of the analysis, they hired and had put together this report called the Economic Impacts of I-49 Completion. Federal projects are required to have benefit cost analyses. They look at all the benefits, they compare that to the costs, and they come up with these ratios and say, here's why we economically are going to do this project. So I want to show you what's in this report, because as Rob said, some of the things made us mad. When you read this book, this part should make you mad. The report lays out three different economic impacts. The first one is save time and wear and tear. The second one is the impact of new development and new growth. And the third one is what they call network effects. And I'm gonna break each of these down for you real quick. The first one, save time, I think is best understood with this old Highway 91 project. It's now done in California, but the idea here was that they were going to widen some lanes on a highly congested corridor. The cost of this project was $1.4 billion. Here's how it was reported in the local paper, the Orange County Register. The project will give some relief to drivers in the regular lanes, raising their average rush hour speed from 8 miles an hour to 9.4 miles an hour. I don't know what the culture in Southern California would appreciate this all that much. But here in Minnesota, your life is not made any better because you can go 9.4 miles an hour instead of 8 on your commute. Nonetheless, from an engineering standpoint, the way we would look at this and come up with a cost benefit analysis, we would say, all right, it's a $1.4 billion project. But if we look at, the time savings, each person's going to save 25, 30 seconds on their commute. Multiply that by 200,000 vehicles a day that go through here. Multiply that by 365 days a year. Multiply that by 50 years that we think these extra lanes will be there. Multiply that by $25 an hour, which is the average cost of the salary and benefits per hour that Southern California resident will make. And all of a sudden, this $1.4 billion project creates something like $5 billion of benefit. Even though the benefit is, measured in microseconds each day that each one spends, the fact that there's so many cars and so much congestion means that this project is justified. There's a huge financial benefit. This is bizarre. This kind of math doesn't make any sense, particularly not today when we're adding lanes. I mean, maybe when we're connecting San Diego to LA for the first time, but when we're putting on the 16th and 17th and 18th lanes, not so much. In Shreveport, the numbers are even crazier, right? The number of through trips on the I-49 connector, so people that will go all the way through and not stop, 235 a day. That's not a typo. The total commuters are a little over 3,000. I want to give you some perspective on these numbers. I said they're not a typo. This is my street. This is my little street in Brainerd, Minnesota, where I live. That sidewalk on the right is actually my house, goes, connected to that sidewalk. My little street, so in front of my kind of sleepy small town house, gets 455 cars a day. The through trips on the I-49 intercity connector are 235 per day. The cost of this project, the I-49 project, $700 million. So this is a system, and I want to give you this confidence going forward. A lot of the things that we see in highway building today are insane. People stand up with straight faces and degrees and initials behind their name and make arguments on how this is really good. And we look at it, we're like, this is crazy. I want to give you assurance that, yes, this is actually crazy. In this report, they said they're going to save 53 cents a trip. That's $1.4 million increase in what they call household income. Every time you take a trip, you don't get 53 cents of household income. You save 53 cents worth of time theoretically. But they've said that's 1.4 million. And over the 20 years of the project, that's a $45 million in aggregate savings that all of us in Shreveport will share because of this highway being built through this neighborhood. So we got 45 million in time and wear and tear kind of save. The next impact is development. And this is where, I mean, the time saved is actually a crazy number. That's the most credible of the three numbers, right? This one actually becomes is where things get absurd. So there's a paradox in these reports. And you don't have to scratch very far below the surface to find it. The paradox in the report is that there's going to be all kinds of increases in growth and development and energy and people because of this highway investment. But there's actually going to be a decrease in travel time. So in other words, you're going to be able to have your cake and eat it too. There's going to be lots and lots of people and activity and stuff going on, but there's not going to be too much, people and activity and stuff going on because that would create congestion. So in the first part, we have all this benefit from reduced congestion. And in the second part, we say, yeah, but there's going to be all this development, like all this stuff going on, AKA congestion. they estimate the development impact at $800 million per year. So every year after this highway is built, there's going to be $800 million of economic activity as a direct result of this highway. That number kind of just emerges. It's kind of like pulled out of the sky. I was going to say something a little more vulgar than that. It's kind of just like pulled out of thin air, this $800 million. I want to show you how absurd this is, because when you look at the other numbers they have in the report, it kind of shines that, this is a nonsensical number. $800 million per year is $237,000 per year per commuter. Shreveport is actually a rather poor city. I put this photo up here of what the typical commuter in Shreveport must look like after this project, because that's, again, like not a real number, right? That doesn't make any sense. The report projects a number of new jobs in Shreveport. This is the population in Shreveport, how it has shrunk over time. That last 2030 bit at the end there is a projection based off of the overall trend line. Here's the number of jobs that is being projected, 30,600, and how it compares to that population loss. Basically, all the population loss they've had and more would be made up in new jobs that would be created solely because of this highway, like jobs that would not happen theoretically without this highway. Again, this is clearly not a real number. And then this is my favorite one, $800 million per year. If you look at that in terms of commuter trips, that's 9.1 new jobs per trip. And that got me thinking, like, what kind of industry creates 9.1 jobs per trip? And I figured they must be in like the clown car industry, right? Like I don't, the people in Shreveport are going to pack a whole ton of people in their cars and make a whole bunch of value for driving around on this new highway. Again, I laugh, the clown car thing. This is an absurdity. These numbers are not real. They're really like being pulled out of the air. And of course, when we look at this, it's important to understand how they count this economic development. They'll say, we're projecting a new McDonald's here. And of course, we can look at this system and understand that with declining population and McDonald's that was built 25 years ago up the road, what this means is that the old McDonald's is going to close and there's going to be a new McDonald's on the new interchange. This is how this kind of development works. And if you step back and you did an honest evaluation, you would say there's $10 million of new sales from the new McDonald's, but there's $10 million in lost sales from the old McDonald's. And if you were to compare those two in an economic analysis and add them up, you would say 10 million in new sales minus 10 million in lost sales equals 0, right? But that's not how the report does it. The report says there's $10 million in economic activity as a result of this highway. Do that over every Walmart, every strip mall, every, Verizon wireless store. And you could get a whole bunch of money aggregated per year that you can project out, kind of ignoring the impacts on the rest of the system. These are fraudulent numbers, and they don't stand up when you start to internally reference them to the other numbers that they use in the system. Nonetheless, we've got 45 million in save time, and now we have 16 trillion, 16 trillion in development. Again, less credible as we go. I'm going to give you the craziest one here at the end. And if you want to, batten down things so you don't start throwing things at the screen, please, this is a trigger warning, because the network effects are the most absurd. In the report, they cite, and understand this is a benefit cost analysis to decide if the federal government should allocate almost $1 billion to Shreveport, an amount of money that is like 1.5 size of their entire annual DOT budget. So this is like a serious undertaking, right? In this report, they refer to this other report by a guy named Prudhomme and Lee, a pair of researchers, university researchers, who wrote this report called Size, Sprawl, Speed, and the Efficiency of Cities. If you ever look at this report, the report is kind of like a conversation between two researchers who are pulling data from different cities in France and in South Korea. But the people who put together the I-49 benefit cost analysis pulled out one line from this report, and it's this one: increasing speed by 10% increases labor productivity by 2.9%. So if you can move more people more quickly through the city, you can actually increase labor productivity, and that has all kinds of network effects that we can quantify here for our benefit cost analysis. Prudhomme is from France. He teaches at the University of Paris. He looked at 22 cities, not including Paris, throughout France. Lee is from Seoul, South Korea. He looked at 3 different cities and data they had, 3 different cities, not Seoul, in South Korea. In order to kind of get our minds wrapped around what was being put forward here, I looked for a city in France that had a population similar to Shreveport. And my French is horrible. I know this is a beautiful name, and if you speak French, you could say this beautifully. I can't. I'm from Minnesota. I never learned French. So I'm not even going to pretend to say this name. But you've got 2 cities of roughly the same population. In France, the city's 30 square miles. In Shreveport, you've got 4 times the area, right? 4 times the distance. Remember, the idea here is if we can speed people up, we increase labor force productivity. The fascinating thing is that this is probably true if you're in France, right? If you're in a French city that is a well-designed place where you have real neighborhoods, things within walking distance, you've got real transit systems getting people around places. Yes, if you can speed this up, if you can increase the efficiency of your transit system, if you can, eliminate some of the congestion that you see in these places and allow people to get places more quickly, you can probably see labor force gains. But you can see that Shreveport is a very different place. And the idea that you would go to this European study and like cherry pick this one line out of here and say these conclusions from this place on the left really translate well to the place on the right is an absurdity, right? These are 2 very different places, and the idea that there's some kind of correlation is just crazy. So we pull out this line: increasing speed by 10% increases labor productivity by 2.9%. Prudhomme and Lee. The I-49 economic impact study says that this is going to have an impact of $62,118,727 over the next 20 years. You have to admire the brass of such specificity, right? Interestingly, later on in the report, there's a line, again, from Prudhomme and Lee that says when the average potential job home distance increases by 10%, the effective size of the labor market decreases by 11.5%. So think back to this French town. When you spread people out and you give a lot of distance between them, your productivity and your labor market goes down. That would seem to, if we're cherry picking things out of a report from France to use in Shreveport, that would seem to be applicable, at least equally applicable, if not more applicable than the last correlation that they brought out. Of course, they didn't include this in the analysis. They said there's no impact to this. We're going to ignore this completely, even though this kind of defines what Shreveport would look like. So we've got $45 million in saved time. We've got $16 trillion in development impacts. And then we have $62,118,727 in network effects over 20 years. This is an absurd analysis. And this maybe takes the absurdity of these benefit cost analysis 1 degree beyond what we normally see. But I want to tell you that this is very typical of what we see in other places when we're doing similar kind of projects. In the book, and I apologize for my vanity here for putting a picture of myself, but there's a quote from the book. This goes beyond rigor to something rightly thought of as institutionalized dishonesty. And that's exactly what this is. This is a lie that we tell ourselves when we want to justify new construction, when we want to justify a project. This is an institutionalized way that we have used and abused what should be a very rigorous process for producing these types of analysis. We should want to know as a society, are these good investments or not? And the reality is that this system that we often assume is working to develop that type of conclusion is actually been co-opted by an engineering industry, by an economic development industry, by the highway building industry that simply wants to build more stuff, regardless of if it makes economic sense for us, for the country, or for the community. With that, we'll give a pause here, and I'll wait for Jocelyn to come back on, and we're going to chat a little bit. Thank you. Oh, you are paused, Jocelyn.
Oh,
you are
I'm
you are
muted.
on
Oh,
mute.
is this better?
Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you. Perfect. There we go.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Thank you for that. And just talking about this book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer: Transportation for a Strong Town. It's not necessarily a standalone work, but part of a series that includes your briefing, both the 2019 Strong Towns, the Bottom-Up Revolution to rebuild American prosperity. Can you explain the progression and interplay between these books and also your upcoming planned books?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. For many years, I was kind of working up to writing a book. In fact, I started writing the blog back in 2008 as a way to organize my thoughts and get to a point where I could write a book. And for years, I had kind of been putting together outlines and dealing with different publishers. And the reality is there was too many things to pack in. And so the way I was able to do the first book, Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution, was really by taking all of the talk about Stroads and transportation and all of that out and just focusing on the way cities are built and the way the underlying finances drives that development pattern. The second book on transportation now came out this month. We are working internally here. Daniel Harrigus and I are co-writing a book on housing. And so that will be the third book in the series. The fourth book is going to be on economic development. And then the fifth book is going to be on urban design. And then I've decided I'm going to retire, and maybe I'll just hang out with CNU full time.
I don't think anyone would protest that. So in addition to this book, online, you've got a great repository of information and people that are really interested in the contents of this second book. Could you talk a little bit about that website in case anyone on this webinar wants to find it and sort of what's included in the website?
Yeah. Well, so let's take that two ways. For this book in specific, we created a website called confessions.engineer. That's the we bought the .engineer domain, confessions.engineer. So you can go there, and there's a bunch of supplemental material on the book. Every chapter has maps, photos, images, quotes, dialogue, videos, supporting material. And so the book is meant to be, well, I always write for my dad. My dad is a guy who worked at the paper mill and then went back to school and became a teacher, not an academic, but someone who will read if you put a good book in front of him. I always write for my dad as the target audience. And so the book is very readable. It's very accessible. It's designed to tell a story. But for those people who want to get more technical, confessions.engineer has got all that information. Strong Towns, of course, we've had the website for, over a decade now. And there's just a huge backlog of information, all of it, which is Creative Commons license. So all of it is free for everybody here to use, to access, to share. I like to tell people, if I've written something on Strong Towns that you find really compelling, feel free to copy it, paste it into your own document, put your name on it, pretend you wrote it. Like, I don't care. We're really trying to just get these ideas and this message out. And if you can use our work for good in your community, please do that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I just want to remind the viewers that there is a Q&A button, and we are going to be taking some questions from the audience at the end. So if there's anything that's come up, please feel free to enter it. We're logging them, and we'll be asking Chuck those questions at the end. But I did want to get back to the book. You spent a lot of time talking about the contents in Chapter 8 and sort of justification analyses for huge highway expenditures. In Chapter 2, you spend a lot of time talking about the difference between streets and roads. Degrading roads to make them more street-like or degrading streets to make them more road-like reduces the overall value provided by the transportation system. And so I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I feel like there's a number of things in this book that are deeply subversive. And by subversive, I mean, we've created a certain power structure in local government around transportation spending. In fact, the next slide, which I didn't do, I'll flip back to this right now to my presentation because I forgot I had one more in here. Comes from Willie Sutton. Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is, right? And in our transportation system, what we do is we tend to define lots of local problems as transportation problems and empower our engineers, because that's where the money is, that we're about to, at the federal level, approve hundreds of billions of dollars of transportation spending. Lots of cities will be getting lots of money to do transportation projects. The idea of taking what is the standard practice of engineering and the language they use, particularly the hierarchical road network, the idea of local streets going into collector streets, going into arterial streets, that whole framework and that whole conversation is around the idea of moving traffic quickly. And it's one of those like base concepts that's never debated, that's never discussed. By stepping back and redefining our systems in different ways, in ways that elected officials, local advocates, and others can not only understand, but then start to use as either a road or a street, it takes, I think, what is a really powerful insight of CNU and makes it active in a way that people can use. So a road is a connection between two places. We can think of it as a replacement of a railroad, which is a road on rails. And if you think of the base nature of a railroad, you get on in one spot and you get off in another, and there's a high-speed connection between the two. A street then is a platform for building wealth. And sometimes, you know, my friends push back on me a little bit here. Like, why are you focused on wealth? Wealth and good placemaking are highly correlated. Wealth and quality of life is highly correlated. What we're doing in a city is we're trying to build a viable place where people want to live, invest in, stay, be part of. And so a street is a platform for building that place. And local officials can, you know, the book very clearly in chapter 2 says the idea of making this decision, is this a road or is this a street, is not a technical one. It's not that we need an engineering degree to be able to do this. It's not that we need to bring in some expert to do this. This is a social decision. This is a decision that we can make as a community through our elected officials, through whatever process, and say, over here, we're trying to build a place. That is a street. Over here, we're trying to build get from one place to another. That's a road. And that designation should have huge implications for not only how we think about these places, but how we approach them from a design standpoint.
Right, and maybe feeding that is an almost total deference to commuters, right?
Well, I think, yeah, when I say subversive, what I'm really talking about is getting away from the engineer-dominated view, which is about speed and volume of traffic. And this relates to a whole economic model based on commuters, you know, coming in from the distant, driving through the middle of the core of the city, and get to an economic model that is really about place. How do we build great places? And how do we make the building of great places the foundation of our economic system?
Right, right. And you briefly mentioned rail in there, so I'm going to kind of latch on to that. In this book, you're a bit critical of high-speed rail, which is part of some ambitious climate change proposals like the Green New Deal. You don't explicitly mention modern streetcar systems. However, several cities have built or are exploring building a modern streetcar system, including Kansas City, Detroit, and my own city,
You're at,
Cincinnati,
yep.
which has it. Yep. And so I just would like you to explain your critique of high-speed rail first, and then also whether any of those critiques apply to modern streetcar systems.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Because, you know, the writing I do on, I think there's 90,000 words in this book, and I probably wrote 500 on high-speed rail, but it is something that a lot of people ask because it's the thing people are talking about. I am very much a diet and exercise kind of person, as opposed to the wonder pill kind of person. And I think, you know, using that analogy and applying it to cities, there's a whole lot that cities should do, could easily do today that would improve people's lives, that would make their places more productive, that would be a walk, don't run kind of strategy, that sit on the sidelines. And they sit on the sidelines waiting for the big transformation to come. For me, high-speed rail, I mean, I've ridden high-speed rail in other parts of the world. It's wonderful. I'm not going to suggest that it isn't. But if we step back and look at the urgent needs of our cities today, I find it to be here in North America more of a distraction than anything else. If the idea of high-speed rail is that somehow it is a transformative investment for climate change, I find that to be on its face rather ridiculous, particularly in comparison to the benefits that we could have by just allowing people the mechanism to walk 1 or 2 blocks to get somewhere. That is almost, if it's not impossible physically, it's so despotic in most of our places that people just don't do it. And the gains that we could make in terms of climate, in terms of reduced carbon emissions, just by making fractional investments in walking and biking would be enormous. That being said, the streetcar thing is very interesting because there is a very powerful mechanism that streetcars bring about, particularly on, look at the name. It's a streetcar. It's not a road car. It's not. It's a streetcar. And when we're talking about building spectacular places, what we see is that the best places, the places that people want to be in, the places that are most financially productive, eventually crowd out the automobile. And they crowd out the automobile by having higher and higher levels of great transit service and great pedestrian space. And they don't crowd out the automobile because they hate cars and they're anti-American or whatever we want to say. They crowd out the automobile because the automobile is a very expensive, very low returning type of investment. When you have automobiles, you have to store them. They take up a lot of space. All that space can be used for more productive things. And so streetcars are part of a mechanism by which we incrementally build wealth in places. They're part of that replacement of the automobile that happens. I think, the challenge always is, when are we ready for it? Like, when are we ready to crowd out the automobiles? And what you see in places like Cincinnati, or particularly the one that I'm most familiar with, is what you see in a place like Memphis, where they did the streetcar, or Kansas City, is that the streetcar is not crowding out anything. It has to ride within traffic. It has to sit at street lights. It's not given the deference and the priority that it should be to actually be a real viable transit investment. And so I don't think that makes it a bad investment, but it does call into question our commitment to it. And also, the amount of return and value that we're actually going to get when we do those things. Yeah. I in that chapter where I talk about high-speed rail, and where I talk about, I think it's called fads or something. I can't remember what I called the chapter, but I spend the whole beginning of that chapter talking about walking, and how, if we were to just like not be a bipedal species, but someday, but we could go and like sell people on, hey, now you can walk, it would be like the greatest innovation in all of, it is the greatest innovation in all of human history. The fact that we can walk on 2 feet around, and so many things in our society that we struggle with would be made easier if people actually just walked a mile or 2 a day. And from a public standpoint, we should be seeking to make that as easy as possible. Great. That's the low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
Yeah. And I see some people from Cincinnati on this call, and I know they'll appreciate that insight. I do want to go back to the high-speed rail question, and this is a bit of a question out of ignorance, but when you start to, you talked initially about justifying these expenditures. When you start, with transportation as the largest carbon emitter in the country, when you start factoring in cost retrieval for mitigation, does that help the justification much more? And is that being done at any great rate?
So let me say this because I know a lot of people on this call are very enamored and taken by high-speed rail. And I'm not going to stand up here and say that it's not superior to the number of auto trips we're taking that is not superior to flying from LA to San Francisco, that it wouldn't be great to be able to get on a high-speed rail in New York and make it to Washington, D.C. I get those arguments, and I respect the fact that if we're looking at option A and option B, that high-speed rail makes a lot more sense than building a bunch more highways or even electrifying the automobile fleet. That being said, I still will go back to, and you know, I live in Brainerd, Minnesota. I live in a small town in northern Minnesota. I spent last week in Shreveport and Sulphur Springs, Texas. I spent it outside of Dallas. You know, I spent it in the, let's just say the middle of America, right? Which is a little bit different than the places where high-speed rail is being discussed today. And in our conversation here, in particular, and I do think in those as well, but let's start here. I think there's such urgency to do basic things that are in front of us. You know, in so many places we can't walk. It's 6 blocks from my house to the core downtown. 4 of those blocks are really nice. The last 2 are horrible, and they're horrible because of the highway we built through the middle of town. That is easily fixable, and it's fixable in pennies, fractions of pennies on the dollar of what we would spend on, you know, large carbon mitigation, and it would have huge amounts of impact in terms of people driving less and emitting less carbon. That it really bothers me that we are in many ways distracted by the shiny object, when really our cities need to thicken up fast. They need to become financially productive. They are insolvent. They are struggling. We are hurting people's quality of life. We are doing deep damage to society because of the bad financial decisions we're making on the local level. We can align a pro-environment, pro-carbon policy with a policy of bike, walk, and building great cities in a way that I think is transformative and powerful and will have much greater impact than anything we could do, you know, silver bullet, big project kind of way. Does that, you've asked it twice, and I hope I'm.
No, you did. And Robert, do I have time for one more question before you move into
Yeah,
Q&A,
absolutely. Good.
Okay. It's just one more question. You know, I think the pandemic has brought into public consciousness a lot more than before the way that streets can serve actual humans instead of solely automobiles. And do you see this as perhaps a larger cultural shift, or do you see this as maybe a fleeting moment in time?
I see. Yes, I think both. I think I think the way this I think will play out is that the great places, and we're in, I think, a period of transition right now where, you know, cities are all redefining themselves. I think the ones that become the next generation of great places will be the ones where this is not a fleeting moment, where this is something that they latch onto and use as kind of an affirmation that we can do something different. I think the places that are very quick to unwind this and go in the other direction are going to be the laggards in sense of reinventing themselves and figuring out what this next version of America is going to look like.
So I wanted to remind everybody to use the Q&A function of Zoom and to ask your questions. And it may be a good time, Jocelyn, to get to Q&A from the audience.
Yes, definitely. So I will ask our first question here from Billy Cooney, sorry. Is there a name for this intellectual trickery that engineers engage in, namely adding up marginal individual benefits to claim a larger collective benefit that is effectually not collective? Additionally, can engineers be retrained to identify this as a fallacy?
Let me start with the last part. I think the answer is yes, and I hope and pray that it's yes. I feel like what has happened here is, I think we do a disservice if we look at it as nefarious. I don't think the people who put together the I-49 project in Shreveport, put together the economic analysis, actually thought they were perpetuating a fraud. I think they're just using industry best practices. I just think they're using like what is an accepted approach within the industry. This is what their peers do. This is what everyone does. And the thing is, if you have a certain worldview about moving automobiles quickly, moving high volumes of automobiles quickly through cities, none of this like rubs up against your worldview. So you can be a completely coherent, thoughtful person with a completely messed up view of how things actually work without being like something nefarious. I do feel like the answer here is twofold. It's one, yes, we need to educate engineers differently. We need to get this out. But I think two, we also, and this is why I wrote this book in the way that I did, is to subvert power from these systems. When I sit down with my own local engineer and I talk to him about this, he's like, no, like this, you're wrong. But when I talk to my city council and he hears me doing that and they go back to him and then it starts to like move around the community, all of a sudden now he's not getting it from an antagonist. He's getting it from his boss or an ally or a friend or a neighbor. And it starts to open up things. And I have a sense that, most humans are very good. I think most engineers want to do good things. We just have to get them a different toolkit, a different framework in which to think about this stuff. And quite frankly, take away their power, shift that power to other people who can make, I think, the more critical decisions about placemaking.
Great. And this does kind of feed into the next question from Mina Lee Johnstone. What is the math on the cost of physical and mental health from all the pollution, noise, and accidents?
I think that is a good question. And I think that is a worthy question of exploration. It's not one that I spend a lot of time on. And it's not one that I have an answer for. And I'll say why I don't spend a lot of time on it. I've been at, many, my career for many years was going to city council meetings. I mean, I've done the 10,000 hours plus at planning commission meetings and council meetings and all the places where decisions like this are made. And the person shows up with all the data and all the arguments about public health and mental health and environment and go down the litany of things, that we should be doing. And then, the one person shows up and says, well, I can create 5 jobs, or we're going to build this new building, or, some economic impact. And that just crowds out everything else. And so I don't think that those are like illegitimate arguments. But what we try to do at Strong Towns and what I've tried to do since I started writing the blog in 2008 is try to correct the fallacies and the economics, because that is really what is crowding out the other legitimate considerations like, the cost of mental health and pollution and what have you. I mean, we have I hope what I showed you in the beginning of my presentation was that we're making decisions that have this veneer of economic to them, like someone sat down and ran a benefit cost analysis and, oh, I'm not good at math, or I don't know numbers and this sounds official and whatever. And it's a bunch of crap. I mean, it's not real. Like, this is fictitious. And I think that if we can get that message out, it opens up the conversation for all these other messages.
Great. And we have another question here from Nathan Norris. So when we're talking about, I thought, CNUR, so when we talk about who is going to change the system that gives hope to cities, securing gigantic funding for poorly planned, elevated interstates running through these cities, what is the path for change from your perspective? Big question.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I have an easy answer for it, but I'm trying to think of how this answer would go down for Nate or for others. I read in the book, and I wrote a piece for CNN earlier this year that talked about the Interstate 35 through Dallas and talked about this project in Shreveport, and then also talked about South Bend, Indiana, where Secretary Buttigieg is from, was the mayor. And in this piece, I tried to make the argument that the interstate system is done. Like, we built it. We did what we set out to do. In fact, it was done many, many decades ago. Let's declare victory and move on. And I actually think that if you look at the history of federal funding of major transportation infrastructure, it is more a case of have the money, find the project, than have the need, find the money. And so I would, if given unilateral decision-making process, I would go to a maintenance only transportation approach at the federal level, and I would turn it all back to states. And I would love to have this conversation in 50 states where we could, debate real return on investment. But if you have a federal government that can print money and borrow money and basically, come up with trillions of dollars of infrastructure spending to do projects that we don't want and don't need and actually are doing harm, to me, the answer is, why would we support any federal action on this? I would like to see the interstate system and all the kind of gas tax surrounding, trust funds and all that just wound down. And that would put us kind of like Canada, which has no similar system to we do. And you're from Canada, you can get around there pretty well.
Yeah.
I feel like the infrastructure bill that we have now, particularly the bipartisan consensus bill, is basically a highway building bill wrapped in a veneer of, happy talk language to try to make it go down with a bunch of coalition partners. And I would like to see it not be passed. And I think we'd be better off if it wasn't.
Okay. And this question is for Rob, which he can answer at the end. One anonymous attendee wants to know how they're going to get their credit for attending the training. So Rob, I'll let you cover that at the end. But this is a question that kind of plays into what you just said, and also specifically to the Shreveport project. If you worked at any economic impact numbers you feel are more appropriate for the Shreveport Highway, positive or negative?
So, I mean, the short answer to that is yes, but I think the deeper answer is like, who's measuring and what are you measuring? A lot of what gets measured in these analyses come from a federal perspective. I wrote about this in the first book in terms of Hurricane Katrina. If you are a federal bean counter, you're an economist at the Treasury Department or the Bureau of Economic Statistics or whatever, and you're blind to any human pain and suffering. You're blind to the hopes and wishes and dreams of people. You're just counting beans in a spreadsheet in Washington, D.C. Hurricane Katrina was a major positive event, right? It created all kinds of jobs. It created all kinds of economic transactions. If your measurement is GDP and unemployment, Hurricane Katrina was a huge panacea for you. It boosted GDP multiple quarters after it happened. If you are a poor family in New Orleans, and your family's wealth, as modest as it might be, but your wealth and capacity is wrapped up in a building that has been handed down to you multiple generations, and all the relationships that you have in your neighborhood, including with your minister and your friend next door and the woman up the street who looked after your sick kid, and your life is one based on putting together great gumbo recipes and having wonderful music and enjoying a quality of life. All of a sudden now Hurricane Katrina is like the greatest disaster you've ever experienced. It wiped out your wealth, your capacity, your ability to live the life that you wanted. So whose measurement matters? Whose measurement counts? Like what measurement should we be motivated by? And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot at Strong Towns is building wealth actually means building wealth for people, for small businesses. It means neighborhoods becoming, having more capacity to do more things within them. And that is often at odds with the economy we've created that is very focused on transactions, as those transactions can be measured in GDP, can be measured in a rising stock market, can be measured in a growing bond market. These things are all negatively correlated with overall human prosperity and flourishing. And that's kind of where, if we were going to measure the impact in Shreveport, you look at I-49 and I take, Miss Dorothy Wiley's house. Dorothy, I spent some time with last week. She's a beautiful, wonderful woman who's trying to get her neighborhood to be a prosperous place. And she's struggling because this sort of Damocles of the highway is hanging over it. And what would look like success to me is Miss Dorothy's property becoming 5% more valuable next year and 5% more valuable the year after, and her having more neighbors with more capacity, and eventually, having the wealth of the neighborhood grow incrementally over time. That would be success. But that doesn't correlate to the way we measure it in a national sense.
Right. And sorry, jumping around a bit, Chuck, back to talking about the federal infrastructure plan. This is a question from John Young. We know, assuming the infrastructure plan passes, are there opportunities to use federal money to do good for cities, or at least potentially limit the impact of unending highway widening?
Yes, but it will happen at the state level. This package is being passed without reform. So, there was some talk early on about having reform be part of this. The impetus now, and this is not a partisan statement, the impetus now is really about getting a bill passed, so we can demonstrate bipartisan bona fides and what have you. As a political strategy, I have no comment. I don't really know. But what it means from a practical standpoint is that any reform will have to happen at the state level. Your state will get the money, and the money sometimes comes with strings, but a lot of times it's just lump sum given through legacy programs. And states can change legacy programs to a degree. And so what we'll have is a state by state kind of, reckoning of how this money should be spent, and where it should go. Some of it, though, is going to come through the old legacy systems, and it's going to, like, this is amount for highways, and this is amount for this type of transit, and this funds this program and that program, and there's not a lot of discretion in that, which is very sad. But yeah, John, which, by the way, didn't I call John like the best looking guy in Kansas City? I think or in Cincinnati. I think I said that once. John, I love you, man, yeah. But you're going to have to go to the state legislature, which is not in Ohio, it's not an inviting place for you right now. I would like to see more power given to cities to have the discretion to do things, because the reality is that we're going to spend $1 trillion on transportation infrastructure. And the reality is that if you actually look at the problems that most of our places are facing, they're not transportation problems. We make them into transportation problems because that's where the money is, but they're not transportation problems. Okay.
And this is getting a little strategy. This question is from Ryan Amaton. I apologize if I mispronounced that. A question I also have as a planner. It seems like planners, maybe not engineers, are most interested in these topics. And how do we engage engineers in the things we're talking about here?
I think with, I was just going to say, with any human, and that makes it sound like engineers are not humans. When we're engaging with people, and this is something that we talk to our members about a lot at Strong Towns, we have to do more listening than we do talking. We have to do more understanding than we do preaching. We have to be humble. And so all of these things happen on relationships. I feel like there's a dual strategy that has to take place here. One, and you see this throughout the new book, there are places where we say, this is a decision being made by engineers today that is not an engineering decision. Whether something is a road or street is not an engineering decision. It does not require an engineering license, degree, training, any background. We can make that decision for ourselves and then instruct our engineer in terms of what the ramifications of that are. There are other places where, we delineate in the book, here's decisions that engineers are really good at making. Here's decisions that engineers are not good at making. We need to make these. So I think a combination of really trying to engage, listen, be humble, have conversations with, but then also shifting power. I mean, at the end of the day, these all come down to people and how people make decisions. And when you empower, when you give one department or one person or one silo a huge budget, lots of discretion, you let them make decisions that are beyond, their knowledge set or their background base. And then you give other people the ability to comment on it as like a way to have input. What you've done is you've concentrated lots of power. At the local government level, we can diffuse that power and see much better outcomes. And I think let engineers be who they are, which is really good problem solvers. We've just asked them to solve the wrong problems and then giving them kind of unchecked authority to develop a whole set of understandings around that, a whole set of misunderstandings around that.
Okay, I'm going to mention that we are now at the hour point, and we got more questions to answer, so we're going to keep on going. There, for those who have to leave, we will be posting the video on the CNU website within about a day. I wanted to talk a little bit about there is an AI CP credit that is available if you watch this live, and there's a CNU A credit available if you watch it live or in the recorded video. For anybody who has a question about that, please put your email in the chat and we'll respond directly. There should be something as well in our email we'll be sending to all the registrants. But I'm gonna actually take a prerogative to ask a question, Chuck, if I can. In the book, you talk about speed, then capacity, safety, and cost as the priorities of the engineering system right now, and you kind of critique that order. There's nowhere even mentioned, you can talk about that, but there's nowhere even mentioned in that the public realm. It doesn't make the list. And in a city or town or neighborhood, the public realm is like so important for everybody's life. And engineers are the designers of the public realm, the chief designers, and they don't seem to acknowledge it exists. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it goes back to, and it kind of goes back to what Jocelyn asked me very early on. You know, what we've asked engineers to do is to move vehicles, and then everything else becomes a subordinate task to that. And so my recitation of what the design process is, and then understand that in chapter 1, I talk about the process that engineers use to design streets. They start with the design speed, and then they look at the design volume, and then they say, okay, given these two parameters, what does the code book say is a safe way to do this, and at what cost? It would be at that point that you would then start to add in the extras, you know, and I use the air quotes there. These are the extras. And so I talk a little bit in the book about complete streets. Complete streets is a approach that I think is a rational one, and I go to kind of great lengths to applaud what I think is the decent human good things about it. But the reason why it has, I think, been as effective as it has been through the state DOTs, you know, getting adopted and getting passed down and getting some funding, is because it doesn't challenge the priority system of the engineering profession. Complete streets is one of the extras. So once you get through designing for cars and the speed and the throughput that you want, then you can say, okay, how do we add on a place for people to walk and a place for people to bike and a place for transit? How do those things happen? The reality is that a great street is actually a compromise of speed. It actually puts the safety of people, and I think we could put the safety of people, we can draw a straight line to that between the safety of people, the comfort of people. I mean, this is channeling Jeff Speck here a little bit and what makes a good walk, but that whole rubric that he's created, you're correlating that quality of place, quality of a walk with safety. If we put that first, what we recognize is that there has to be a compromise on speed and volume in order to have that place. There has to be a compromise in the throughput of traffic in order to actually build a place that is safe, that people want to be, that is that great walk that Jeff describes. And so I don't ignore it as much as I, deal with the reality as the decisions are being made. What we want to do is we want to get people on streets with the right value set, which begins with safety and begins with place and begins with kind of that correlation between the two, and acknowledges that in order to get that, in order to get that value that we all share. In those places, we have to sacrifice speed, throughput speed. We have to sacrifice volume of traffic. And if we're willing to take that leap, which the standard engineering design process is not willing to do, all of a sudden, all the rest of our jobs as new urbanists become way easier. If that's on the table, it's transformative to us as a group.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
And we'll go back to some questions from audience members. So this one applies more to rural county roads from Jean Schwenneson. Our rural county roads, largely dirt, are a major topic of comment to our engineering department. I tell complainers that the only way to improve their streets is to get their neighbors to agree to form a road improvement district, to tax themselves enough to pay for it and its maintenance. Is this an appropriate Strong Towns response?
Yes, double thumbs up. Fantastic. And it's very interesting. I grew up on a farm. It was a farm homestead by my great-great-grandparents. And when I was a little kid, the road was like 2 tire tracks through the woods. I mean, that was like the road. And I could get to town, into Brainerd, into the city in like 8 minutes, right? I mean, you drive the little dirt road, you'd get to the major county road. That was a kind of a smaller road too. You take that in, and then you got on a little, like maybe a mile and a half of highway, and then got into town. It took 8 minutes. If my parents were going to leave their house today, which, the school district bought up land by them, built a big school, they made a, huge wide roadway out in front of their house, roundabouts and all this. And it's, very impressive. And then you've got the widened out county road, and they've added all this capacity. The reality is they can get to town now in about 8 minutes. It really hasn't changed their travel time at all, because now you've got signals, you've got other, you've got all these other things that go into it. There's a farm to market road program through the federal government that goes down through the state governments that basically gives money to upgrade rural roads with the idea that this will help farmers get their stuff to market. And it's completely misplaced money. It's money that is spent improving marginal speeds on marginal roads that if you just drove really slow, it would cost you an extra minute of time for one guy with a tractor. It's really a silly kind of program. And if we instead spent that money not building out the interchanges and the Walmarts and the kind of continual frontage roads up and down our highways, but instead allow those highways to really move products from one market to another, that would have way more transformative effect for farmers than, giving them a paved road in front of their place. But yeah, Gene, you're on the exact right track. Let them pay for that themselves.
Great. And moving into a question from Kenneth Munson, this is a question that I also experienced doing some pedestrian safety overhauls in my own neighborhood and working to that and being told that certain things really aren't possible because of fire department mandates. Have you looked at fire department or emergency vehicles? And have you looked at fire department mandates for wider street widths and large radius at intersections, and how your work sort of deals with that in building streets?
Yeah, this is horrible. The thing that I've come to recognize, though, about fire departments is that they're a trailing, not a leading type of influence. So in every city where I've run into this, like I'll just take mine, the fire department will say, well, we have to have these really wide streets and like disaster will happen if it just doesn't occur. And they've got this standard, and then they buy bigger trucks, and they're like, it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. And so then we go out to the, handful of pleasant, nice, small streets we have, and we take the council members and we take the members of the public and we say, so this street has to be ripped up. And they're like, oh no, we would never do that. Well, how can you not? Like this doesn't meet your standard. And it's like a culturally a step too far for the elected leaders to follow this crazy fire department edict. And so the way to deal to me with the firefighters is, again, to shift power to other places. You have to start with a different value set. I actually think that Jeff Speck in his 101 rules for walkable city. Do I have that one sitting back here? Yeah, walkable city rules. This one right here actually describes this beautifully. Jeff, I don't know if you're here, but I'll give you an advertisement. It describes how you make fire department officials basically like the safety officers. And so they're responsible for more than just getting to the fire quickly. They're actually part of an overall conversation about safety in the community. But then you don't give them veto power over the streets. Like literally, you let them enter the conversation at a different point. Today, we bring them in as allies of the engineer who wants to move traffic quickly and at high volumes. And you bring them in as their ally, and then they can find all kinds of reasons to do that. You bring them in at a different spot where it's like, okay, we're building a street, we're building a place for people, a place to build wealth. That is going to mean slow traffic. So this is what we have to do from an engineering standpoint to make this place successful. And then the question becomes to the fire department, how do you make this then safe? That's a different question. Because that may mean you need a smaller truck. That may mean you need a different response. That may mean something else, but you're bringing them in at a point where the kind of geometric or the value decisions have already been made and are done. Does that make sense, Jocelyn?
It does.
Okay.
It does make sense. Yep, it does. We are jumping around a little bit. I apologize.
You're fine. No, it's really good.
But it does go back to something that you talked a lot about today. Do you know of anyone, this is from Marina Curie, I believe, do you know of anyone who is tracking or has gone back to look at what economic impact projections were for a highway expansion and then compared it to the promises made, not traffic projections, but just the economic impact part?
Yes, Marina, I appreciate that question. I've seen it done anecdotally. I've not seen it done like in a broad sense, let's do a systematic study of this, largely because all of this stuff, and this is, I think, the big tell, all these economic analyses and projections are done in pursuit of landing the project and getting the project done. Nobody, and this is going to sound deeply cynical, but I don't think it's that nefarious. Nobody is really interested in whether this works out or not. There's no like department trying to figure this out. The task that everybody has within these systems is the next project. It's not evaluating the last project. No politician wants the project reviewed that way. Sure, they'll go to the ribbon cutting and they'll point to the anecdotal things that say very good, but no one wants like a systematic analysis. And so there's really no like mechanism to even gather the data. The closest thing that I've seen is what Joe Minicozzi's group, Urban 3, put together in Kansas City, where they went back and they looked at the tax increment financing packages that had been done. And they said, okay, here's what we gave them. Here's what we got. Like, did this make any sense? And these were like a decade or two later. And, systematically over and over and over again, it was really sad and pathetic what resulted. So Maria, I wish there was a good study, and I wish there was a way to point to like, here's someone who did that, but I've never seen anything like that, not systematically.
Okay, great. Art Llewellyn has asked a really specific question about Oregon, but I think it gets into a question that all of us are probably thinking as concerned citizens, most effective ways to plug in, maybe a concerned citizen that's a little more sort of educated on these topics than the average, but Oregon State DOT has many questionable highway widening projects in the works. My concerns about widening I-5 through the Rose Quarter conclude it will increase traffic hazards, accident rate, and severity, i.e. fatalities. I've submitted these concerns in detail, but ODOT refuses to address them. I've tried to get a lawyer to file a complaint, but what should concerned Oregonians do?
Oh, I got the rest of the question. And then the last part, like, what should you do? I don't know. Because I think the thing to understand here is that the highway department looks at safety and safety reduction differently than you do. It looks at, different than reality, I think. In COVID, one of the things that we experienced early on in the pandemic that kind of blew everybody's mind, not me, not I think a lot of people on this call, but a lot of people out there in the transportation world, was that even though driving was dramatically down, fatalities were way up. And you start to see this incoherence from places like the National Highway Transportation Safety Board, issuing these press releases, begging people, literally begging people to start wearing their seatbelts again and stop driving drunk, as if like all of a sudden the pandemic hit and we all just became like, what the hell, we're going to die anyway. Let's go drive without seatbelts and speed and drive drunk. This is an absurdity. They made it sound like all of a sudden we had this epidemic of reckless behavior, when the reality is what happened was the congestion that normally calms traffic and makes our crashes into fender benders instead of fatalities was gone. And so what was left were massively over-engineered roads, stroads, and interchanges where people could use that full capacity of the road all day and all evening. And they were driving really fast. They were driving excessively fast, and you had more crashes. And because you had more crashes, the number of people with seatbelts problems and with, all of that started statistically to show up. But it was not like some epidemic of recklessness. It was the reality is that most of what we spend building in what engineers think of as safety into systems is actually the opposite. It actually creates danger. The traffic congestion overcomes that and makes it seem like it's less. But if you look at any city, when do the fatalities happen? They happen at night. They happen in off hours. They don't happen during peak hours. They happen during the times when there's like a modest amount of congestion or kind of free flowing traffic, because that's when you get high speeds and you get complexity in the system. If you go to rural areas, there's much higher rates of fatalities and crashes in rural areas. And it's not because we're drunkards. It's not because we are somehow like more reckless than all of you. It's because our systems are over designed and we have less periods of congestion that compensate for that. And so we're driving in more dangerous environments all the time. I don't know what as a citizen you do to overcome this. Again, I kind of get into the idea that I think that the main thing we can do is start to focus our neighborhoods, our local communities on building great streets, shift that conversation locally so our city engineers are actually allies in building great places and not kind of allies of this speed and volume mantra. And if we can do that, I think the DOTs are really functionally broke. I mean, they have way more lane miles than they have capacity to maintain. And so at some point, they're also going to have a conversation about how we do things differently. And I think if we are the decision, if we're doing good practices at the local level, we're in a good position to influence that debate differently as well. Sorry, Rob, if I went a little long.
No, not at all. I mean, we're kind of getting toward the end of the Q&A. Jocelyn, do you have any final questions or comments or things that you want to say?
I did just want to say for the last point, I mentioned that in my own neighborhood, I've gotten involved in some pedestrian safety measures. And so that is one way that you can get involved. And it's sort of a basic advice, but through getting involved in my community council, I was able to help be a steward and communicate with my neighborhood about the different pedestrian safety measures that were available to us. And we confronted exactly some of the issues that Chuck, talked about. And a lot of it was sort of, why on this, on an overpass that is basically a highway leading onto a highway that bisects my neighborhood, which is extremely walkable. It's got a walkable business district bisected by a highway going onto a highway. What does it look like when someone's at the pedestrian intersection and they apply to cross? What does having a pedestrian phase of the light look like? And so asking that question to your city officials and having them say, we could do that, but we won't. We will only do that in your campus. We would only do that in like the most high traffic area of the city, so your neighborhood stays bisected. So that's just like sort of one example, but finding out the way my city is approaching these issues. You know, engaging in this way has been super, super helpful and informative.
That's a great example. That's a great example. And I mean, it's, if we go back to like the climate discussion, a lot of people will say, you know, like, well, how do I affect the United Nations, and how do I get, you know, US climate policy changed? And I get that like motivation, like I respect that. But the reality is that most of us can have a very tiny impact on those places, but all of us can have a huge impact on our neighborhoods. And part of what we're trying to do at Strong Towns is like mobilize that change, because when we're all doing things that empower our neighborhoods and make them better places, we're actually transforming everything. And we're creating room for others too. I mean, I think one of the things that we've been able to do quite successfully at Strong Towns, and CNU has been a leader in this too. You look at like parking minimums. Parking minimums was a niche thing. And we, you know, 7-8 years ago, started to put a map together to say, here's all the places that have done it. And now it's far more ubiquitous. And we all know in the trenches, the first thing that a public official is going to say is, well, what city's done this before? You know, where's the example? I don't want to go first. Like, who's the other place that's done this? And by having, you know, as you guys and as Strong Towns and as CNU has composited all these examples of places doing great things, it becomes easier for other people to imagine it being done as well. So Jocelyn, that's a great example of local leadership.
Great. Well, thanks again, Chuck, for joining us today. And Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, I'm going to plug it for you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, order it online.
Thank you.
And I echo, thank you very much, Chuck. And thank, you know, it's always really enlightening to hear you talk. And thanks, Jocelyn, for doing this. With that, and I want to thank everybody who's listening. And we'll see you another time.
Sounds good. And we'll see you in Oklahoma.
Yes, really. I'm looking forward to that.
I am too. This will be fun to get back together with all my friends. I haven't seen many of these people that I love and care about for a long time. So it'll be good for all of us to get together again.
All right.
I'll see you, Jocelyn, there.
Sounds good. I'll be there.
Yep.
Bye. See you.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Robert.